During the Great War, artillery erased towns overnight, but in one French village, the bombs never fell. German maps marked it, pilots flew over it, yet shells never touched its cobblestones. The reason was never recorded in history books, but whispered by survivors because the village paid a price in blood. But before we begin this forgotten tale of war and horror, if you enjoy dark stories of battles, ghosts, and soldiers lost to the shadows, make sure to subscribe and give this video a like. It helps us bring you more chilling stories from the front lines of history. Now, our story begins in the year 1916, on the scarred fields of France, where one village stood untouched, though the world around it burned. The war had carved the land into wounds. For miles in every direction, the countryside was reduced to a ruin of craters, collapsed trenches, and shattered tree stumps blackened by fire. The French called this part of the front La Zone Rouge, the red zone where nothing grew, nothing lived, and nothing survived for long. Captain Adrien Marchand had walked through villages before, or what had once been villages, piles of stones with no roofs, doors hanging from splintered frames, and wells filled with mud and bodies. But here, as his patrol crested a rise overlooking a low valley, he stopped dead in his tracks. "Mon Dieu," whispered Corporal Henry Delatour, the young radio operator at his side. Below them lay a village, untouched. Whitewashed cottages lined cobblestone streets, smoke curled peacefully from chimneys. A church steeple stood tall, its cross gleaming faintly under the grey sky. Even the fields looked green, as though the war had forgotten this patch of earth. Marchand squinted. His boots were still caked with muck from shell-pitted ground. Just behind them lay trenches where dozens had bled out only days before. Yet here, a pocket of serenity, surrounded by hell. Henry's voice trembled. "It shouldn't exist, Captain. Not here." "Quiet," Marchand snapped, though his throat was dry. "It exists. That is enough." The patrol of 6 French soldiers moved cautiously down the slope, rifles slung but ready. Their helmets clinked softly, and the wind carried the faint smell of manure and baking bread, scents Marchand had not known in years. The air was warmer, as if the cold had been held at bay. Villagers emerged to greet them, men in plain wool coats, women with kerchiefs, children clinging to skirts. None bore the hollow eyes of refugees. Their faces were flushed with life, though their expressions held something else, not relief at seeing soldiers, but unease. An old man stepped forward. His back was crooked, yet his voice was steady. "Bienvenue. You must be weary." Marchand cleared his throat. "This village, how has it not been touched?" The old man gave a slow, careful smile. "Because we are protected." "Protected?" Henry muttered. His hand lingered on the receiver box slung at his hip, as though the familiar weight could tether him to reason. The old man gestured toward the church. "Our patron watches over us." Marchand's eyes followed the line of his hand. The church loomed at the center of the village. Bells hung silent, yet he felt a strange vibration in the air, like the hush before an artillery barrage. "Captain," one of his sergeants muttered under his breath. "This place, it doesn't feel right." Marchand ignored him. The war had taught him that any place spared from ruin was a miracle, yet miracles were in short supply, and he trusted them even less than luck. The villagers ushered them into the square. Bread was broken, wine poured. Children watched them with solemn eyes as though measuring them. Every gesture of hospitality carried an undercurrent Marchand could not place, gratitude laced with caution or fear. As dusk fell, he walked alone along the narrow lanes. Candlelight flickered behind shuttered windows. The fields at the village's edge lay untouched by shell craters, yet he could hear the distant thunder of guns. The war was still near, only a few kilometers away. He paused near the chapel steps. The stones were worn smooth, damp with evening mist. He touched the wooden door. It was warm, almost feverish, beneath his palm. A voice tugged at his sleeve. A child stood there, a girl with tangled dark hair, no more than 10 years old. Her eyes were large, too old for her face. "They once step bomb us," she whispered. Marchand crouched to her level. And why not? Her lips curved into the faintest smile, because others are chosen instead. A chill rippled through him. He opened his mouth to ask more, but the girl had already darted back into the shadows, vanishing behind a corner of stone. The chapel door creaked faintly, though no one pushed it. A low draught escaped, warm and smelling faintly of iron. Marchand stood there, frozen, while the bells above gave a single dull clang, though no rope was pulled. The child's whisper, "Others are chosen instead," and the church door exhaling iron-scented air. Captain Adrian Marchand sat at the long oak table in the village inn, a glass of red wine untouched before him. Around him, his men ate hungrily, steaming stew, fresh bread, food that belonged to another world entirely. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth. For the first time in weeks, his soldiers laughed, if only in brief bursts. But Marchand did not join them. He studied the villagers who moved about the room, serving quietly, eyes lowered. Their politeness was too measured, too rehearsed, as though every word was weighed before leaving their lips. Corporal Henry leaned close, whispering, "Captain, you feel it too, don't set you. Something here is wrong." Marchand did not answer immediately. His gaze followed a young woman carrying bread across the inn. Her hands trembled just slightly, her face pale despite the warmth of the fire. When her eyes flicked up to his, they darted quickly away. "Yes," he murmured at last. "They are hiding something." He tried to convince himself it was the paranoia that war bred into every man. Villagers were often strange around soldiers, afraid of both protection and reprisal. But here, the fear was different. Not of Germans, not of hunger. Something deeper. That night, he walked alone under the moonlight. The streets were empty, shutters drawn tight. The air was unnervingly still. Only the chapel at the heart of the village stood awake, candles burning behind its windows. As he approached, the silence pressed harder against his ears. His boots clicked on the cobblestones, echoing too loudly. The wooden doors loomed, painted with old flaking red, their hinges blackened with age. He hesitated. He was not a man of faith anymore, not after Verdun, not after the mud and the rot. Yet some part of him craved explanation, meaning, structure. If this village had survived untouched, perhaps here he would find it. He pushed the door. The chapel smelled of incense, but beneath it lingered something else. Coppery, metallic, sharp. Rows of pews faced the altar, where Sister Genevieve knelt in prayer, her habit casting her face into shadow. She did not turn as he entered. "Captain Marchand," she said softly, as though expecting him. He froze. "How did you?" She rose slowly, her hands folded before her. "The war drives men to doors they never thought to open. You come seeking answers." Marchand swallowed. "I come seeking truth. Why is this place spared? Why do shells not fall here?" The nun's eyes lifted, catching the candlelight. They were weary eyes, not unkind, but shadowed with something heavier than age, because sacrifice buys silence. He felt his stomach knot. "Sacrifice? What do you mean?" She tilted her head toward the altar. "Faith alone is not enough. Blood speaks louder to the sky than prayer, and so long as the pact is kept, the bombs will never fall." Marchand took a step back, shaking his head. "Superstition, madness." Genevieve's lips curved in a sad smile. "And yet you have walked miles of craters, and here you sit in warmth. You drink in peace. Tell me, Captain, is that madness or miracle?" His voice sharpened. "At what cost?" She did not answer. Instead, she turned, walking toward the heavy wooden doors behind the altar. As she opened them, a rush of warm air escaped, thick with iron. Marchand glimpsed the stone steps spiraling downward into darkness. The nun's voice was almost a whisper. "We all bear burdens, Captain. Some carry rifles, others carry sins. Here, we carry both." Before he could speak, she closed the door. The boom of the latch echoed through the chapel like a cannon. Marchand staggered back out into the night, his chest tight, breath ragged. The moonlight seemed colder, sharper. From somewhere in the darkened houses came a sound, a muffled sob, quickly stifled. Behind him, the chapel's bells gave a single hollow toll, though no one stood at the ropes. Marchand sees the hidden stairway beneath the chapel, but the nun closes it, leaving only the echo of the latch and the toll of the bells. Corporal Henri Delatour set the radio case down in the small attic room the villagers had offered him. The floorboards creaked under his boots, dust rising from the corners. Outside, the village slept in silence, broken only by the occasional bark of a dog or the distant thunder of artillery miles away. He opened the case carefully, his hands steady from years of habit. The war had made him an extension of the radio, its wires and dials as familiar to him as his own veins. In the mud of the trenches, he could string an antenna through the wreck of a tree, while shells whistled overhead. Here, the quiet unnerved him. The villagers had given him a candle, but its flame guttered each time he touched the radio's metal. Static filled the attic, a dry crackling hum like endless whispers brushing just beyond hearing. He adjusted the frequency, listening for German artillery chatter, the clipped tones of officers, the coordinates that meant death. Instead, he heard something else. Henry. His head jerked up. It was faint, buried in the static, but unmistakable. A voice, a French voice, speaking his name. He leaned closer, twisting the dial. "Allô? Identify yourself." Only crackling. Then slowly, another word formed. "Marie." His breath caught. Marie, his sister, dead 2 years now, killed when a shell struck their family's farm. "Who is this?" His voice cracked too loud in the stillness. He lowered it to a hiss. "How do you know that name?" The static hissed, growing louder, until he thought the candle flame would smother under its weight. And then came another word. Clément. Henry froze. Clement was not family. Clement was a boy he'd seen in the square that afternoon, no older than 12, his cheeks smudged with flour as he carried bread to the inn. Henry's hands trembled as he scribbled the name in his notebook. The voice did not stop. One name after another slipped through the static, each one a villager he had glimpsed that day. And finally, silence. Henry sat back, heart hammering, sweat prickling his skin despite the cold. The candle sputtered low, nearly gone. At dawn, as the bell tolled for morning mass, Henry stumbled outside. The villagers were gathered in the square, whispering. At the center lay a figure, covered in a sheet. The smell of iron filled the air. Marchand pushed through the crowd, his jaw set hard. He pulled the sheet back. It was Clement, the boy from the bakery. His throat had been cut clean, ritualistic. His eyes were still open, wide in frozen shock. Henry staggered backward, bile rising in his throat. His notebook slipped from his hand, the name Clement staring back at him in his own scrawl. He whispered to Marchand, his voice shaking. "The radio, it told me. Last night, it said his name." Marchand gripped his shoulder hard enough to hurt. "Not another word of this. Do you understand me?" "But Captain." "Not another word." The villagers carried the boy's body toward the chapel. Sister Geneviève walked before them, rosary clutched in pale fingers. Her face was unreadable, her lips moving in prayer or in something that only resembled prayer. Henry turned, staring back at the attic window where his radio sat, silent now. For the first time in years, the comfort of wires and static felt alien to him, as though he had been tricked into listening to a voice that did not belong to this earth. When the bells tolled again, the sound seemed less like mourning and more like warning. That night, when Henri lay in his bunk, he did not sleep, because each time he closed his eyes, the static began again, whispering new names he dared not write. Henry hears the names of villagers before they die, and now the voices won't stop. The chapel bells tolled low and heavy, though no one had pulled the ropes. The sound rippled through the stone streets like a command, summoning the villagers from their homes. Lanterns bobbed in the dusk, illuminating pale faces, bowed heads, and lips moving in hushed prayers that did not sound like Latin. Captain Adrien Marchand watched from the edge of the square, his hand resting uneasily on the grip of his revolver. His men muttered beside him, exchanging nervous glances. They had faced artillery barrages, gas clouds, and midnight raids, but this gathering of quiet, obedient villagers unnerved them more than the front lines. Sister Genevieve emerged from the chapel, her black habit rustling in the chill wind. In her hands she carried a silver basin, its rim darkened by stains that no amount of polishing could hide. She set it at the base of the chapel steps and looked out at the villagers. "You all know why we gather," she said, her voice clear, strong. "The sky spares us because we remember the pact. We endure because we do not falter." Her gaze swept over the crowd and lingered on Marchand. A murmur spread through the square, soft as the hiss of wind through leaves. Marchand felt his stomach tighten. He took a step forward. "What is this? Enough of riddles. I demand to know." Genevieve regarded him with eyes that held both pity and iron. "You demand truth, Captain. Then come." The villagers parted as she beckoned him into the chapel. Lantern light flickered on stone walls, throwing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Inside, the smell hit him first. Incense, yes, but stronger was the copper tang of blood. The pews had been pushed aside. The altar was bare except for a single candle and a chalice. Dark liquid pooled within. Behind it stood the heavy wooden doors Marchand had seen before. Genevieve gestured toward them. "Every war brings fire. Every fire brings ash. But this village has never burned. Do you wonder why, Captain?" Marchand's voice was hoarse. "You sacrifice your own." She inclined her head. "Not our own. The chosen. The pact decides." "The pact? With whom?" Her silence was answer enough. She crossed to the altar, lifting a small clay bowl. With a practiced hand, she dipped her fingers into the dark liquid and traced a symbol on the floor. A circle intersected by jagged lines. It shimmered in the candlelight as if the stone itself pulsed with heat. Marchand's breath caught. The lines were not random. They formed a map, and at the center of the circle, marked in crimson, was a name. His name. Adrian Marchand. His blood ran cold. "What game is this?" "It is no game," Genevieve said softly. "The pact speaks through blood, and when it speaks, we must obey." He staggered back, revolver half drawn. "You expect me to believe this madness?" "You already believe," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes shone in the dim light. "You have seen villages erased from the earth. You have seen maps marked with crosses of ash, and yet here you stand, untouched. Your disbelief is nothing but fear." Marchand's grip trembled. He wanted to shout, to deny, to drag his men from this cursed place. But deep inside, in the hollow where his faith once lived, something stirred, a dread that whispered this was all true. Behind him, the chapel doors rattled as though struck from within. A muffled moan seeped through the wood, low and pained like voices crying from a cellar. Marchand froze. His men shifted uneasily, crossing themselves. Genevieve set the clay bowl down. "The burden of command is heavy, Captain. You have sent men to die for strategy, for ground, for nothing. What is one more life, if it means a village is spared?" Her words cut him deeper than any blade. He saw again the faces of soldiers he had ordered forward at Verdun, men who never came back. Their ghosts already haunted his nights. Now it seemed their number might soon include him. The doors rattled again. The moans grew louder, shaping words he could almost understand. Genevieve whispered, "The pact has named you, and when the time comes, Captain, we will obey." The candle flickered, and the shadows on the wall stretched long, longer than any human shape should. Marchand sees his own name painted in blood as the chosen sacrifice, while the chapel doors moan with voices from below. Lieutenant Klaus Ritter stood over the map table inside his command dugout, cigarette smoke curling in the lamplight. The war had taught him many things: the exact arc of a 77 shell, the timing of a creeping barrage, the mathematics of destruction. War was ugly, but it was logical. Calculations led to certainty. But one square on his map refused to behave. The French village sat within easy range of his batteries. It had been marked for bombardment 3 times in the past month, yet not a single shell had landed. Reports conflicted. Some said the shells vanished mid-air, others that they buried themselves harmlessly into the earth without detonating. One crew swore their entire gun carriage had cracked in half when they fired toward the coordinates. Ritter's superiors blamed faulty ammunition, sloppy crews, but Ritter did not tolerate excuses. He had checked the shells himself, loaded them, measured the charge, sighted the targets, and still nothing. Tonight, he would see for himself. The guns lined the edge of the forest, their barrels angled toward the low valley. The village's church steeple was visible even at dusk, a pale finger pointing toward the sky. Ritter climbed onto the gun carriage, field glasses pressed to his eyes. The steeple glimmered faintly, too clean, too perfect. "Fire," he ordered. The first 77 shell roared into the night, trailing fire. Ritter tracked it through his lenses. The trajectory was flawless. It should have struck the church squarely. But just before impact, the shell slowed. Ritter's breath caught. The air around the steeple shimmered like heat over desert sand. The shell twisted, bent mid-flight, as though caught by an invisible hand. Then it vanished, snuffed out of existence, leaving only darkness. The ground did not shake. No explosion came, only silence. The crew stared, mouths open. "Reload," Ritter snapped, voice harsh to mask his unease. Again, one after another, the guns thundered. Shells flew, each one bending, twisting, dissolving before reaching the village. Some burst mid-air in blinding flashes, yet produced no shockwave. One cracked open above the steeple, raining metal fragments that glowed like embers, but by the time they fell, they had turned to ash. The crews murmured, crossing themselves. Ritter ground his teeth. Enough of this. Load gas. The men hesitated, then obeyed. A green-painted shell was heaved into place, its markings clear, chlorine. Ritter watched it arc across the sky, trailing an invisible poison. It, too, vanished. Ritter slammed his fist against the carriage. Impossible. Physics does not bend for peasants and priests. But then he noticed his map. The paper lay across the table in the dugout, weighed with stones. As the guns fired, black marks spread across the map, creeping like burns through the parchment. The village square turned black, the ink bubbling as though seared by flame. Symbols appeared, jagged lines intersecting circles, shapes Ritter did not recognize, but that filled him with a cold dread. He stumbled back, his cigarette dropping to the dirt. The edges of the map curled inward, smoking without fire. His crew clustered around him, gasped. "Lieutenant, it's sex cursed," one whispered. Ritter's jaw clenched. He wanted to bark that curses were for children and peasants, but the words stuck in his throat. His eyes returned to the distant village. The steeple still stood, untouched, serene amid a world of ruin. The only sound was the echo of his own failed barrage, rolling like laughter across the night. Suddenly his field telephone crackled. He seized it, eager for normalcy, for orders, for anything human. But what hissed through the line was not a voice. It was static, and within it, faint, deliberate, a whisper. Klaus Ritter. His name, spoken in perfect German. Ritter dropped the receiver as though it had burned him. The static continued to hiss from the ground, his name repeating softer each time, until it was little more than a breath lost to the wind. Ritter hears his own name whispered through the field telephone after his shells vanish. The chapel bells rang before dawn, not a joyful peal, but a low, deliberate toll that echoed like a funeral drum. Every villager emerged from their homes, lanterns in hand, faces grim but resigned. It was not celebration, it was duty. Captain Adrian Marchand had not slept. The nuns' words, the symbol painted in blood, the voices behind the chapel doors, all haunted him. Yet when the bells called, he felt compelled to follow, as though an invisible hand pressed him toward the square. His men trailed behind him nervously. Corporal Henri Sipsa's eyes were bloodshot, his lips dry. "Captain," he whispered, I heard them again. The radio. More names. Marchand ignored him. He could not afford to crack before his soldiers. Not yet. The villagers gathered in silence. Sister Genevieve stood on the chapel steps, her silver basin gleaming dully in the weak morning light. Her voice carried easily, calm and resolute. The pact protects us still, but the sky hungers, and the balance must be kept. A ripple of unease spread through the crowd. Mothers clutched children tighter. Men stared at the ground. Then Genevieve lifted her hand. From the villagers 2 men dragged forward a figure, thin, trembling, eyes wide with terror. A young woman, no more than 20. Martian's heart clenched. He recognized her. Elise, the baker's daughter, who had given his men bread only the day before, her hands dusted with flour, her smile fragile but kind. "No," Marchand muttered. He stepped forward. "Stop this." She sits, done nothing. Genevieve's gaze fell upon him. "It is not about guilt, Captain. It is about balance." Elise struggled, her cries muffled by the cloth tied across her mouth. Marchand surged forward, hand on his revolver. His men hesitated, torn between loyalty to him and terror of what they were witnessing. Henri whispered fiercely, "Captain, done set. You done set. Understand. The names. I heard hers last night." Marchand froze. His stomach turned to ice. Elise was forced to her knees before the basin. Genevieve raised her hands, chanting words that scraped like stone against steel. Not Latin, not French, but something older, coarser. The villagers repeated in low voices, their murmurs swelling until they drowned out Elise's muffled screams. Marchand, this revolver shook in his hand. "Enough," he shouted. "This ends now." The villagers did not stop. Their voices rose rhythmic like a heartbeat. Genevieve drew a blade from her sleeve, simple, curved, its edge catching the dawn's pale light. She looked, not at Elise, but at Marchand. Her eyes held sorrow. And something else, inevitability. "Elise is chosen," she said softly. "And if we refuse her, the sky will claim us all." Marchand felt his breath tearing in his chest. He thought of Verdun, of men buried alive by shellfire, of villages obliterated in minutes. He thought of Elise's smile when she had offered bread to his weary soldiers. He could not let this happen. He raised his revolver, leveling it at Genevieve, put down the knife. For a heartbeat, the square froze, the chanting faltered. But then Elise stilled. Her wide, tearful eyes met his, and she shook her head, slowly, deliberately, as though she knew, as though she accepted. Genevieve's blade flashed. The basin filled red. The bells tolled once more, louder than before, drowning Marchand's cry. The villagers bowed their heads in unison. The ground trembled faintly, like a distant barrage, but no shells fell. No bombs screamed. The sky remained silent. Marchand staggered backward, revolver slipping from his hand. His men stood pale, horrified, unable to look. Henri covered his face, whispering, "She was chosen. It had to be her. The names, they are always right." Genevieve's voice carried above the murmurs. "One life to save many. This is the cost. This is the mercy." Marchand's vision blurred. He could not breathe. His oath as a soldier, his duty as a man, his faith in reason, all shattered at once. And beneath it all, one truth gnawed at him like rot in bone. If the names were always right, then his own would come soon. Marchand realizes that if Elise's name was foretold, his own will be too. The night after Elise's sacrifice, the village was unnaturally still. The square had been washed clean, but Marchand could still smell the faint copper tang clinging to the cobblestones. He lay awake in the inn, staring at the ceiling beams, listening for the sound of distant shelling that never came. But across the hall, Corporal Henri Delatour could not lie still. He had set his radio case on the bed, unable to resist its pull. The others feared the device now, whispering that it carried voices not of men but of demons. Henri told himself they were wrong, that he, trained in code and frequency, could find an explanation. And yet, He already knew there wasn't set one. The moment he touched the dial, static filled the room, but it was not random. It pulsed, rose and fell, like breathing. He leaned closer, eyes wide, ears straining. Then the bells tolled. Low and heavy, though no one was in the tower. Their sound bled into the static until the two became indistinguishable, ringing and hissing, merging, twisting into something alive. Henry clutched his headphones. The voices began again. But this time, they did not whisper names. They screamed. Hundreds of voices crying out in agony, overlapping in a chorus of terror. He recognized accents from every side of the war. German, French, English, even languages he couldn't name. They shrieked, as if burning, as if drowning, as if begging for release. "Stop," Henry whimpered. He tore the headphones away, but the screams continued, spilling from the radio's speaker, echoing from the chapel bells outside, vibrating in the very air. The walls seemed to close in. Shadows stretched long across the plaster, writhing like grasping hands. Henry pressed his palms to his ears, but the sound came from inside his skull now, rattling his teeth, clawing at his mind. He stumbled down the stairs and into the street, gasping. The village was dark, yet he saw candlelight flickering from the chapel windows. The bells tolled again, but between each peal he swore he heard words. Chosen, sacrifice, Henry. His name, again and again, woven into the clangor. He fell to his knees in the dirt, clutching his head. "No, not me!" The door of the chapel creaked open. Sister Genevieve stood in the glow, her face pale, her eyes weary but steady. "You hear them now," she said softly, "the voices of those who keep us safe." Henry shook his head violently. "They stir dying. They stir screaming." "They are already dead," she answered. "Their voices remain because the pact binds them here. They suffer so the living may endure." Henry scrambled backward, horror twisting his features. "You mean to say, every sacrifice they don't let leave. They stay." Her silence was worse than confirmation. Behind her, the candle flames guttered, bending inward as though pulled by a breath from below. From beneath the chapel, the muffled screams rose again, in perfect harmony with the tolling bells. Henry's sanity cracked. He covered his ears, but the voices surged inside him, names spilling one after another, faster than he could comprehend. Faces flashed before his eyes, Elise, Clement, strangers and soldiers alike, each torn by death. And finally, Captain Marchand's face, painted in red. "Stop it!" Henry screamed. He snatched a lantern from the street and hurled it at the chapel door. Glass shattered, fire flared across the wood. The villagers rushed from their homes, shouting, dousing the flames before they could spread. They looked not angry, but frightened, as if Henri had broken a law older than memory. Genevieve raised her hand, calming them, her gaze fixed on Henry. "The voices choose who will be next, Corporal. You know this, you hear them, and you know you cannot silence them." Henry staggered back into the shadows, trembling, tears streaking down his face. He did not argue, because he knew she was right. The bells tolled once more. Inside his skull the screams continued, and his name rose among them. Henry hears his own name rising within the screams, no longer whispered but screamed by hundreds of unseen voices. The airfield reeked of oil and smoke as German crews prepared their bombers. Wooden propellers chopped the morning air, engines coughing to life one by one. Lieutenant Klaus Ritter stood beside the runway, his jaw set, his nerves fraying. His superiors had grown impatient. If artillery could not erase the French village, then bombs would. Ritter had argued against superstition, demanded rationality. But as he watched the lumbering aircraft rise into the grey sky, a gnawing dread hollowed his chest. He knew physics, he trusted aeronautics, but the whisper of his name through the field telephone still haunted him. The flight of bombers climbed, forming a staggered V. Ritter followed their progress with his field glasses, the distant specks of their wings glinting faintly. The target was clear, the village below, that perfect square of life in a wasteland of ruin. "Drop on my signal," Ritter barked into the transmitter. His voice was clipped, authoritative. but beneath it trembled something raw. The bomb bay doors opened, black shadows tumbled free, falling gracefully toward the earth. Ritter held his breath. The bombs fell true. He could see their fins glinting, their descent swift, inevitable. They would strike the square, shatter the chapel, turn the cobblestones into rubble. And then the air shimmered. Like a heat haze on a summer road, a distortion spread across the sky above the village. The bombs slowed mid-fall, hanging suspended in the shimmering air. Ritter lowered his glasses, blinking, unable to believe. The bombs hung motionless. Then, one by one, they turned. Not downward, upward. The black shapes arced back into the sky, spinning, twisting like leaves caught in a wind that no one else could feel. They rose past the astonished pilots, past the wings of the bombers, until they simply vanished into the clouds. The engines of the planes sputtered. One bomber shuddered violently, smoke trailing from its exhaust. Ritter's throat tightened as he watched it falter, losing altitude. The aircraft lurched, tilted, then dove. It screamed down not at the village, but into the fields just beyond it. The crash split the earth, fire roaring skyward. Yet when Ritter lowered his glasses, his skin went cold. The wreck burned bright, but the crew inside did not. Their bodies spilled from the fuselage, uncharred, unburned, their faces frozen in terror. They lay scattered in the grass like discarded dolls, mouths open in soundless screams, eyes staring wide, as if they still saw something descending from above. The other bombers wheeled away, engines roaring in panic. Ritter seized his transmitter, shouting for them to return, to finish the run, but their voices broke through in a chorus of fear. 9! 9! The sky is wrong. We cannot. Their words dissolved into static. Ritter staggered back from the radio, sweat dripping from his brow despite the cold. He looked again through his field glasses. The village remained, serene, untouched. And then, the chapel bells tolled. Their sound rolled across the fields, louder than engines, louder than explosions. Ritter swore he felt them vibrate in his bones. For a moment, the bombers in the distance seemed to stutter mid-flight, their wings twitching like insects caught in a web. Then, as if released, they veered hard away, vanishing into the clouds, fleeing the sound. The fire from the crash flickered. The bodies of the crew, sprawled and pale, seemed almost to twitch. Ritter rubbed his eyes, but when he looked again, their mouths had shifted. Every corpse was smiling. And though the wind should have carried only the stench of burning oil, Ritter swore he heard faint voices drifting across the distance. Whispering his name, Ritter sees the dead bomber crew smiling as voices carry his name through the smoke. Sleep came to Captain Adrian Marchand in fits, shallow and broken. The walls of the inn seemed to breathe around him, the shadows stretching unnaturally long each time the chapel bells tolled in the night. He told himself it was exhaustion, but when he finally drifted into unconsciousness, the war came to claim him. He was back at Verdun. The air reeked of rot and cordite, of wet earth and blood. The trenches flooded with red water up to his thighs, the mud sucking at his boots like hungry mouths. All around him, men screamed. Faces flashed past him, boys from Paris, farmers from the provinces, each wearing his uniform, each looking to him for orders. Forward, he had shouted then, voice hoarse, waving them up the ladders into the storm of machine gun fire. He remembered their eyes, wide with terror but bound by obedience. He remembered the crack of rifles, the shriek of shells, and the way their bodies folded one after another, like paper dolls cut down by invisible shears. Now in the dream they rose again. From the mud, from the shell holes, from the piles of corpses. Dozens, hundreds, their uniforms tattered, their flesh grey and sodden. They moved without sound, eyes white and empty, trudging through the muck toward him. Non, non, I tried, Marchand whispered, backing away. I had no choice. Their boots squelched in unison, a relentless march. Some still carried rifles, bayonets rusted, barrels bent. Others had no arms at all, yet their eyeless faces never wavered from him. Behind them the chapel loomed, not the ruined cathedral of Verdun, but the intact village chapel, its bell tower rising impossibly above the battlefield. The bells tolled, low and deep, each strike echoing in his bones. The dead soldiers marched not toward the German lines, but toward the chapel doors, and with each toll, more rose from the mud to join them. Marchand stumbled, falling to his knees. "I gave you orders. I did what command demanded." The nearest corpse bent down, its face inches from his. Its lips moved, voice low and wet. "You are chosen." Marchand screamed. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the candle guttered to a nub. For a moment, relief surged through him. Only a dream. But then he looked at his hands. They were wet. He lifted them into the dim light. Blood smeared his palms, streaked beneath his fingernails, warm and sticky. His stomach lurched. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling to the wash basin, splashing water frantically. The water swirled red, refusing to clear. A knock came at the door. Henricip's voice, thin, frightened. "Captain, are you awake?" Marchand tried to steady his voice. "Yes. What is it?" "The radio. It said your name, over and over. It said Adrian Marchand." The word struck harder than any shell. Marchand gripped the edge of the basin, knuckles white, blood and water dripping onto the floorboards. Outside, the chapel bells tolled once more, and from the square below, faint and terrible, he swore he heard the synchronized tramp of boots, as if a battalion was marching through the village in the dead of night. Marchand wakes to find his hands covered in blood. As Henry confirms the radio repeated his name. The morning broke grey and cold, the kind of light that made the world look like a faded photograph. Captain Adrian Marchand stood at the window of the inn, staring down at the square below. Villagers gathered again, as they always did after the bells. Faces pale, voices hushed, children clinging silently to their mothers. But today there was no fear in their eyes, only expectation. Henry burst into the room, his face ashen, his hands shaking. "Captain." I heard it again. Not just once, over and over like a drumbeat. "Your name, Adrian Marchand. They sipped chosen you." Marchand turned slowly. His revolver sat on the table beside his bed, gleaming faintly in the morning light. For a long moment he stared at it, weighing possibilities that felt like lead in his mind. He could fight, he could run, or he could accept what the pact demanded. Footsteps echoed in the hall. The door creaked open, and Sister Genevieve entered. She looked weary, her habit streaked with candle soot, her eyes red from sleeplessness, yet her voice was steady. "It is time." Henry stepped between them, desperate. "No, take me instead. You don't need him. Take me." Genevieve's eyes softened, but she shook her head. "The pact is not mine to change. It asks for one of command. His blood will carry the weight of many. That is the way." Marchand's throat tightened. His gaze swept the room. Henri's trembling form, Genevieve's unyielding presence, the villagers waiting below. He thought of Elise, of Clement, of the others whose lives had ended beneath those bells. He thought of Verdun, of the men he had already sent to die by his orders. Perhaps this was justice. He straightened his uniform, buttoning his jacket with trembling hands. "I will go." Henry clutched his sleeve. "No, Captain, please." Marchand placed a hand on his shoulder. "You said once you feared being forgotten. Remember me, Henri. That is all I ask." Tears welled in the young corporal's eyes, but he nodded, unable to speak. The chapel doors loomed before Marchand. As he crossed the square, the villagers parted silently, their faces solemn, reverent. Some touched their foreheads, others their hearts, as though blessing him. The air was heavy, suffused with the smell of incense and iron. Genevieve walked beside him, whispering prayers, or perhaps apologies. "You will not die in vain, Captain. Your blood will protect this village. Generations will live because of you." Marchand managed a bitter smile. I wonder if Elise believed the same. The doors creaked open. A wave of heat struck him, heavy with the metallic stench of blood. The stone steps spiraled downward into darkness. Faint echoes rose from below, voices moaning, whispering, weeping. He hesitated at the threshold. For the first time in years he felt the urge to pray, but no words came. He stepped inside. The doors closed behind him with a thunderous boom, like the slam of a coffin lid. The square outside fell silent. Henry dropped to his knees, fists clenched, tears streaking his face. Inside, the bells began to toll. 1, 2, 3. Each strike echoed deeper, reverberating not only through the village, but through the earth itself. The villagers bowed their heads, eyes closed, lips murmuring the pact's eternal litany. Then, from within the chapel, a scream tore upward, raw, human, agonized. Henry covered his ears, sobbing. No, the scream cut short. The bells rang once more, and then silence. When the doors finally opened, Sister Genevieve stepped out alone. Her hands were red, her face pale. She lifted her eyes to the villagers. The balance is kept. The sky will not strike us. The people bowed, whispering thanks. Henry stared at her, broken. And him. She closed her eyes, whispering, "He endures in another way." From the bell tower above, a faint voice seemed to echo with the toll, not a scream but a whisper. Adrian Marchand. Marchand disappears into the chapel, his screams swallowed by the German advance crept cautiously across the wasted fields. The bombardments had failed, the bombers had vanished, and yet orders remained clear: secure the village. Lieutenant Klaus Ritter marched at the head of his detachment, field glasses dangling against his chest, hand tight on the grip of his Luger. He had not slept in 2 days. His men whispered of curses, of bells that drove soldiers mad. Ritter silenced them with clipped words, insisting on reason, on discipline, though deep inside he knew reason had fled these lands long ago. They entered the valley. The village stood untouched, serene as ever. Smoke drifted from chimneys, but no sound of life stirred. No chickens, no carts, no laughter. The cobblestones gleamed faintly in the grey light, washed clean as if by rain. Yet the air was dry. "Where are they?" muttered a sergeant. Ritter raised his hand, signaling silence. Their boots clicked too loudly in the square, echoing off stone walls. Windows stared down at them, shuttered, yet Ritter felt eyes pressing from every shadow. The chapel loomed at the center. Its door stood ajar. "Search," Ritter ordered. His men fanned out reluctantly, rifles raised. One tried the nearest cottage, only to recoil. The hearth still glowed faintly, stew bubbling in the pot, chairs pulled back from a meal half-eaten, but the family was gone. Every house was the same, candles still burning, bread still warm, beds empty. Abandoned in an instant. Ritter approached the chapel, his steps dragging, his breath shallow. Inside, the air was thick with incense, and something else. The copper tang of blood, heavy, cloying. The pews were gone, stacked against the walls. The altar was bare, its stone surface streaked dark. From below, through the open trap-door at the rear, came a faint draught, warm, wet, whispering. Ritter forced himself to look down. The stairwell spiraled into blackness, vanishing into a pit that seemed deeper than the earth itself. He could not see the bottom, but he could hear it. A low murmur like voices chanting in unison. He staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His men would not descend. Their eyes were wide, their bodies rigid with terror. Then the bells tolled. The sound was low, heavy, vibrating through the stone. Ritter's men dropped their rifles, clapping hands over their ears. One fell to his knees, weeping. But Ritter heard something else. Through the tolling, through the echo, another sound slithered. Static, like the crackle of a field radio. He fumbled for his field set. Though he had left it behind at the guns, still, the sound filled his head, hissing, pulsing, and then, a voice. Adrian Marchand. The name repeated, over and over. Each time softer, each time closer. Ritter froze. He knew no Marchand. The name meant nothing to him. Yet as it whispered, his vision blurred. For a moment he saw a figure at the altar. A French officer, uniform blood-stained, eyes hollow, lips moving soundlessly. The bells tolled again. The figure raised his head. And this time, the whisper changed. Klaus Ritter. Ritter staggered back, striking the chapel doors with his shoulders. His men rushed to him, but he pushed them away, stumbling into the square. The voices followed, layered over the bells, repeating his name until it drowned every thought. He fled into the street, breath tearing his chest. The houses loomed on either side, silent, abandoned, but their shadows stretched toward him like reaching arms. Klaus Ritter. The whisper was no longer in the air. It was inside him, curling through his veins, searing into his bones. And somewhere deep below the chapel, where the moans and screams never ceased, he knew another voice had joined the chorus. Adrien Marchand. Ritter hears Marchand's voice whispering his name, binding him to the curse of the village. Weeks passed. The guns thundered elsewhere, carving scars across France, but the little valley remained untouched. From above, German reconnaissance pilots reported smoke rising from chimneys, fields still green, a steeple standing tall. On their maps, the coordinates of the village were marked in red, not for destruction, but for avoidance. The French army never wrote of it in dispatches. The Germans struck it from their orders. Officially, the place did not exist. But still, it endured. Sister Geneviève knelt before the altar, her hands clasped, her face drawn and hollow. Her habit was stained with old blood, her eyes rimmed red from sleepless nights. Yet her voice was steady as she whispered the pact's words, words passed down long before the war, words that had protected the valley since the days of fire and sword. Behind her, the villagers stood in silence. They had no tears left to shed, no joy to show. They were alive. But their survival had cost them their neighbors, their children, their captain. At the back of the chapel, Henri lingered. He looked older now, hair grayer though he was barely 23. The radio case sat at his feet, silent for once. He did not dare touch it, though the memory of voices still rang in his skull. He had stopped writing the names down. What good was it, to know? The pact always claimed them. Geneviève rose, her voice breaking through the silence. We are spared once more. The bombs will not fall here. The villagers bowed their heads, not in gratitude, not in joy, in resignation. Henri's gaze drifted to the altar. He saw it even when he closed his eyes. Marchand's blood soaking into the stone, his scream cut short by the tolling bells. The captain had walked into the darkness willingly, and his voice had joined the others in the endless chorus below. Henri wondered if he would hear it again. When the static returned, outside the valley lay quiet. Birds sang in the hedgerows, a sound rare anywhere else on the front. Children played in the lanes, though their laughter was thin, forced. Life went on, if life could be called by that name. But no villager left the valley. None dared. Those who tried, it was whispered, did not make it farther than the ridge. Their bodies were found at dawn, mouths open in silent screams, eyes staring back toward the chapel as if it had claimed them still. The pact demanded presence. The pact demanded blood. Henri turned and left the chapel. The square was empty, the windows shuttered. He tilted his head back, staring up at the bell tower. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a figure there, a soldier in a French officer's uniform, watching him with hollow eyes. But when he blinked, the tower was empty. The bells tolled once more, rolling out across the fields. Distant artillery thunder answered faintly from miles away, but never here. The village was spared. It always would be. Henri shivered, whispering under his breath, "At what price?" And though no one stood beside him, a voice rose from nowhere, from the bells, from the air, from the marrow of his bones. "Yours, when the time comes." The bells fell silent. The smoke curled peacefully from chimneys, and the war raged on just beyond the valley's cursed borders. The village endures untouched, but bound to sacrifice forever, with Henri marked as the next. This was the cursed tale of the village that never fell to bombs, protected not by steel or strategy, but by sacrifice, by blood that the earth itself demanded. If you survived the night with us, make sure to subscribe, because every evening we bring you a new horror story from the shadows of forgotten war.